And we are recording.
You're live.
We are live. All right, so yesterday we visited a number of pogrom sites in the Łomza region in northeast Poland. And we don't have an agenda here except to discuss our reactions. Do you guys have any thoughts to start us out with?
I think just for me, it was, again, kind of similar to what I've been noticing the full trip, is that once you're actually in the physical locations, you see the intentionality behind everything. Like the locations, how far away from main roads, like moved off to the side, or in some cases, like not, right? Just like right there in the open. So it really changes the perspective of what people were intentionally doing, I think is what struck me.
So in Radzewów a few days before, the owner of the barn was no longer there. Easy to use the barn.
Right.
In Yavabna a few days later, the owner of the barn was, there, but we were told didn't participate.
Right.
I think for me, it was the powerful thing of you teach the Holocaust and you read about the Holocaust and you learn about the Holocaust, but these sites and like these stories are not as widely told or not as widely spread. And so like I learned a lot yesterday, whereas, I already knew a lot, and being in the site is very powerful, but you knew a lot of the stories. And like yesterday, when Lukasz was explaining things to us, and when we're reading the plaques and we're going through the history, you're learning a lot. And I have the Wikipedia page pulled up and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, and so that was really powerful for me to see that like firsthand and hear those stories, and learn a lot, from yesterday. And those stories are still being told and we talked yesterday about how those are still being like unraveled and it's still being processed. I mean, this happened 80 plus years ago, but it's really only been since the early 2000s that we've been talking about it, or they've been talking about it here in Poland in a real way, and they're still not talking about it completely in a real way.
Right.
So that history in some circumstances is still relatively new to a lot of people.
And our final site, Missouri, there is no English language Wikipedia site. There's only a Polish language Wikipedia site, so that's interesting. Part of the reason to create it this way is to see the distance between them. So these pogroms were a couple days apart, a few days apart in some instances. And I sort of visualize it as like a traveling wave of violence almost. It's hard to comprehend for me.
In social psychology, we talk a lot about like the foot in the door phenomenon, and like the idea that if someone complies with a small request, later on they'll comply with a larger request, and that request can continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that kind of stuck out to me yesterday as we were talking like early on. You mentioned that idea of like neighbors and Jewish people in these cities and these areas were like pretty ingrained in society. I mean, they were neighbors, they knew each other. There were obviously Jewish schools and Jewish, synagogues and things like that, but oftentimes kids played together and they were together, and then just a few short years later, they're setting a barn on fire. You know what I mean? I mean, it's wild to me and hard to wrap my head around the fact that can happen so quickly.
And I think it's interesting because I think as historians, you kind of also go through and try to see how to conceptualize this and how this fits into the larger, like what we would just call the Holocaust. Because I feel like, especially in America, but like we have a very, very narrow focus on what the Holocaust is.
Absolutely.
To the point where the Galicia Museum in the very beginning, there was part of the exhibit called Holocaust by Bullets, almost to have to go through to reframe that this does fit in there, where I really think like obviously we shouldn't need a qualifier to it, right? But that we're not sure how it all kind of fits even now that we're like studying it.
The American conception is all about the extermination camps, really.
Well,
right?
and I would even argue it's all about Auschwitz, like nothing else. That's the main point that everybody has access to. Even when you think of other like extermination camps, you're gonna think of like the Auschwitz Gate, right? Like that's always gonna be what comes up.
Yeah. In terms of other social psychological phenomena, I always think about the classic definition of cognitive dissonance, which requires not just that you have these dissonant attitudes going on, but that there's some sort of behavioral change that goes in some way to resolve that dissonance. And it's interesting that in the context here, you almost never see, although I shouldn't say that. We know that there's a large number of Polish rescuers. So clearly dissonance-related attitude change would have turned the switch for some people to save others. But in so many instances, including in the pogrom villages, it seems like the attitude switch went the other way. You've got to confirm. So we learned about the different daily rhythms and weekly rhythms from Łukasz, but yet they purchased things from each other. Their children sometimes went to school together if they were more secularized. And then that switch just got turned, and you were able to say the things that were being said all around you this whole time.
Yeah. Well, and I think so coming back to social psychology, I also think about like fundamental attribution error, right? Like how much of it is like, well, of course I'm participating in this. Look what's going to happen if I don't, versus like, but those people are doing it because they're terrible human beings.
Exactly.
That rationalization.
Exactly. And in terms of the situational effects, do you think, we had a brief discussion of this yesterday, do you think if the Polish villagers had refused to comply with the Germans, who were really only in and out, do you think if they'd refused to comply, they would have been harmed? They must have thought they would be, but maybe they didn't.
I mean, that's an easy story to tell yourself, right? I mean, that's what you would tell yourself, right?
Absolutely.
Because like with fundamental attribution error, you say, hey, it's a circumstance, it's a situation I'm in, I didn't ask for this, it's not a mindset. And you can still point to the Germans and you can say, well, they are the ones who are facilitating this whole thing. I'm just a bystander, or at the very most, trying to save my own life,
Exactly.
So whether that threat was real or not real,
Right.
You can easily convince yourself it's real.
Well, even if you go back to what you're saying with foot in the door, even if it wasn't a threat of violence, it's a threat of losing social standing. It's a threat of possibly losing livelihood, because you have actually seen that done before. So what if you are the next group up? Because that threat kind of, I think, looms in at least some people's subconscious as well.
Yeah, great observation.
And these people have been oppressed by the Soviets for a few years now, and the Germans come in and they say you can loot the houses of these Jews, once they're gone. And if one person starts to, it's a little bit of that de-individuation idea of like, you get the mob kind of going, and well, I'm not the leader, I'm just going with the flow. And that's what I think a lot of this is like, you don't see yourself as the ringleader of this situation, but if everyone else is profiting off of this, you would kind of not be too smart if you didn't, jump in here and profit as well,
The local priests in this area, in the Łomza region, the local priests were talking from the pulpit all through the interwar period about the threat of the Jews, about the sort of internal nature of the Jews as being different and other, and that builds up over time.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Guys, this is great.
Yeah, cool.
Right.